And when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son. He's a lunatic. He is sore vexed. Oftentimes he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. And Jesus rebuked the devil, and he departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, Why could not we cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Here Jesus declares to his disciples the tremendous potential of faith. Now, in our scripture reading, we discovered that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It is trusting God when I don't see any evidence that God is working. It is the confidence that comes from knowing that God is in control. It is thus resting in the love of God and in the ability of God to work the impossible. The psalmist said in Psalm 37, to rest in the Lord and to fret not thyself. And though that is the command, how often we fail to really rest in the Lord, but instead are fretting over the circumstances that we are faced with. Worry, fear, anxiety, fretting are all signs of a lack of faith. Now, the Bible tells us that God has given to each of us a measure of faith. Faith is something that God has just sort of built into us. Trusting is natural. Actually, we learn not to trust. It seems that we by nature just are trusting. But by experience, oftentimes we learn not to trust. We learn that there are certain people that are not trustworthy. But it always seems to be a disappointment, a shock, when we find that a person is not trustworthy. Because by nature, I just sort of trust people. By experience, I learn not to trust some people. Once trust has been destroyed, it is very difficult to rebuild. In marriage, we see this problem often, where one of the partners in marriage has made certain promises but has broken those promises. And because of the broken promises, sometimes there is a breakup in the marriage. The one has become discouraged because of the broken promises. They have put their trust in the other. They have committed their lives to the other. But the other has not proved to be trustworthy. And when this condition creates a separation, so often the guilty person will say, "Oh, I promise I'll never do that again. I promise." But you see, they have promised before. The trust has been violated. And it is so difficult to create again that trust that once existed. So often they'll come to us and they'll say, "Call my wife, will you? Tell her I'm changed. Tell her I'm different." That won't do any good, because you've broken the trust. And the only way the trust can be rebuilt is by time, proving that you are trustworthy. Relations are built on trust. Relationships are destroyed when one proves that they cannot be trusted. Our relationship with God is built on our trust in God. But God has proven himself to be trustworthy. Now, oftentimes, our faith is tested. I say I trust in God. And God oftentimes tests the limit of my trust. As Abraham was given to us as an example of a man of faith, we see how God tested Abraham's faith, asking him to offer his son as a sacrifice on a mountain that God would show to him. Now, God had promised to Abraham that through Isaac your seed will be called. Isaac had not yet had any children. God is now saying, offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And Abraham's faith in the promise of God is being tested. Through Isaac shall thy seed be called. How can his seed be called through Isaac if he offers Isaac as a sacrifice to God? The only way that Abraham can see is that God will raise him from the dead, because God has given his promise to me that through Isaac the seed shall be called. So in that confidence that God will keep his promise, Abraham went to Mount Moriah, and God allowed him to come to the very point of binding Isaac, putting him on the altar, and raising the knife. Now that's faith being tested to the nth degree. And we oftentimes find that God has tested our faith, but many times we fail the test. We so often seem to give God certain deadlines or limits. Lord, if you don't work by Friday at 12 o'clock, then I'm going to have to take things in my own hands. And we oftentimes fail in that test of faith. I have found that he seems to be the God of the ninth hour. that so often he doesn't come through until you're right at the deadline, and in some cases even beyond the deadline. I think of the case of Lazarus, where Mary and Martha sent the message to Jesus, "Come quickly, the one you love is dying." And when Jesus did not respond immediately, Lazarus died. And by the time he arrived at Bethany, he had been buried for 4 days. And Martha said, "Lord, if you would only have been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, "Lord, you could have worked. You had an opportunity to heal him. Now it's too late. You waited too long. It took you too long to get there. And you've gone over the deadline." And so many times we feel, well, the Lord had a chance, but he failed, and he's gone over the deadline, and we sort of give up. But we find that Jesus waited deliberately until it was past the deadline of human possibilities, in order that he might perform an even greater work in the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And I think that sometimes God goes over our deadlines in order to show us even a greater work of God than what we were anticipating. Now, if you will just but put your trust completely in God, these are the things that God has promised he would do and would be for you. He will be a buckler to those who trust in him. He will be entreated by those who trust in him. They will be blessed who put their trust in him. None that trust in him will be desolate. He will deliver those who trust in him. He is a shield unto those who trust in him. They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, that cannot be removed. They that trust in him shall be safe. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God. We read that in Hebrews this morning concerning the faith of Enoch. Before he was translated into heaven, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith, it is impossible to please God. In the story that we have here in Matthew, we see how disappointed Jesus was with his disciples because of their lack of faith. When this father came to him concerning his son, who was a lunatic, he said, "I brought him to the disciples, and they could not cure him." And then Jesus, speaking of the disciples, speaks of his disappointment in their lack of faith. He said, sort of a groaning of his spirit, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you?" And then Jesus commanded the demon to come out, and the child was cured in that very hour. But I wonder how many times the Lord must be troubled by our lack of faith. As we are so worried so filled with anxiety, going around fretting over our situations. And I wonder how many times Jesus doesn't say concerning us, "Oh, faithless and perverse generation, how long do I have to put up with you?" It was at this point that the disciples did a very wise thing. They took Jesus apart and they said, "Okay, Lord, how come we couldn't do it?" They acknowledged their failure, and they're asking Jesus the reason why they were unable to cast the demon out of that boy. And it was at this point that Jesus told them plainly, "It's just your unbelief," and then he gave this little lesson on faith and the potential of faith. If you had faith as of a grain of mustard seed, you could say to the mountain there, "Remove from this place and be settled over here," and nothing would be impossible unto you. Now, whenever I read that, I know how small a grain of mustard seed is. And if I just had that much faith, it could move mountains. It makes me wonder just how little my faith must be. Probably take an electron microscope to find it. If faith as a grain of mustard seed can move a mountain, transplant Mount Baldy between here and Catalina, and I wonder, Lord, do I have any faith?